and thank you for coming for this satellite event for the Battle of Ideas, hosted by Interact Manchester at the wonderful Texture and in association with the Manchester Salon. Lovely to see you all, and so many of you here for what should be a really great day of debate, discussion. So yeah, Ben, do you want to introduce the format?
Yes, hello. We're going to begin with Angela giving a 20-minute lecture on her work, Kill All Normies. This will then go to Cheryl Hudson responding in turn. Then we'll have an extensive Q&A. After the event, we'll have food over there in that corner. We've got to try and feed all 70 of you, so we'll see what happens. But we encourage people to stay, get a drink, eat and chat and stuff. Enjoy.
Brilliant. So just before we start off, a little bit of background on the panel. So from my left to right, so to speak, we have Dr. Cheryl Hudson, who's a lecturer in American history at the University of Liverpool. Then we have Angela Nagle, who's authored the book Kill All Normies. So Angela, over to you.
Okay. I was just thinking, the first time I was in Manchester to speak at an event, I was actually speaking about almost exactly this topic. It was something like 5 years ago, I think. But the panel was on the subject of counterculture and the political usefulness of counterculture. And I was saying, you know, actually there is a kind of emerging counterculture online, and you won't like it when it starts to have a lot more influence than it already does. So I was talking about kind of the culture of 4chan and stuff like that. So the research for this book originally started about online anti-feminist forums and kind of subcultures. And at the time, the thing that made them interesting to me was the fact that they didn't really resemble traditional anti-feminist politics, in that they weren't really Christian or conservative. They didn't really have any sense of tradition, to the extent that they would even refer to a kind of more traditional gender roles. It was like to troll kind of, you know, like easily offended people and stuff like that. So it was very much about kind of enjoying the fun of being irreverent and to make fun of the easily offended and stuff like that. So it very much resembled kind of, it had a kind of punk sensibility, if you like, and it had a kind of countercultural sensibility. So I just had a feeling that that was going to be something that was going to be very influential. And that was, and particularly the kind of culture around 4chan at the time. But the thing that I was trying to think through at the time also was the fact that I would go and, you know, the kind of anti-feminist politics that was on, say, the red pill and stuff like that was interesting, but I felt the most creative stuff was coming from 4chan, so that's the one that I was looking at the most. You know, so I would go to, say, you know, and I would see, you know, absolutely horrible stuff, sort of like traumatically horrible stuff. And then I would read people in academia and people, you know, ostensibly progressive people talking about 4chan and the kind of cultures that were coming from 4chan as something libertarian and progressive and something generally positive. So in academia, for example, where you know, certainly in the humanities, there is a kind of a, you know, liberal kind of hegemony, if you like. But why I was wondering is that on this one forum, everything is permissible. Whereas if some sort of like nice, harmless conservative said, you know, maybe the family is okay, they'd be sort of booted out. But if you say, you know, whatever, the most like gruesome misogynist kind of stuff that was on 4chan was fine. So I was kind of trying to work through why that is and what kind of strange biases were at work among kind of progressive people that meant that misogyny in that form was acceptable and much milder forms of it elsewhere were not. And so I guess I was thinking that it was because of that sense that if it's countercultural, it must be left-wing. If it's countercultural, it must be progressive. At that point, I mean, now that's so obviously not the case, but at that point, I think people were still clinging on to that kind of idea that the right can't possibly be countercultural, and the right cannot be transgressive, and so on. That is the kind of the thing that the left does well. And so in a way, the culture, that kind of culture was mistaken for something it wasn't. There is a kind of a theory that there was a different 4chan back then, and there's a, that there was a kind of a moment where the politics of it changed. And I've kind of really argued against that, because I think that the seeds of what it became were there from the very beginning. It was always about ritualized cruelty against the weak, where they would bully sort of like one teenage girl and stuff like that. It was more complicated than that, but that was in there for sure. It was very much about the enjoyment of humiliation of people, and all these quite sadistic kind of group activities, that there was kind of pleasure in engaging in these together. And so it's not actually that hard to see sort of how you end up flirting with kind of fascism, and with, sort of dehumanizing people who are, drowning in the sea and stuff like that. That it's that kind of aestheticizing cruelty that was there from the very beginning, before it had kind of formal politics. Another thing that was happening at the time, one of the reasons why there was this blindness to it, I think, was that it was that kind of very cyber-utopian sort of moment, where you had the Arab Spring, and you had the Occupy movement, and everyone was writing about how the internet was going to democratize culture and democratize media, and it was going to bring in this new age of everyone participating, and all the kind of legacy media, or the old media, if you like, was going to be torn down. Now, if you fast forward to now, in a way that has happened, but it's been a right-wing phenomenon primarily. So I mean, who do you think of now when, if you think of somebody saying like the media is full of lies and it's all manipulation? You're more likely to think of Donald Trump than Noam Chomsky now, and even, I was thinking, when I was an undergrad, if you were on the left, you were probably part of the anti-globalization movement, whereas now you might think of like globalism and so on as something that the right talks about. So that kind of suspicion of the media, suspicion of globalism, I know they're slightly different ideas, but there is a strange kind of a similarity in a way. And the way I ended up kind of trying to theorize it in the book was kind of two ways. One was some interesting stuff that was written about subcultures, kind of music subcultures, which I went back and looked at. And obviously they were all sort of pre-internet, but a lot of them, there were certain interesting parallels. So, I referenced Sarah Thornton, who wrote this kind of very good critique, Angela McRobbie did as well, of the way in which subcultures had been written about by people who were biased toward the subcultures, or they liked the subcultures, so they wanted to believe that they were politically progressive. So everything they did suddenly became resistance, and it was a very generous kind of an interpretation of subcultures. And she was kind of saying, actually, no, there are all of these other things going on in subcultures. They're incredibly elitist, for example. They're incredibly contemptuous of mainstream society. And there are all these other kind of things at work. They police the boundaries of the subculture by hating people who are on the outside, by being, elitist in terms of whatever it is, wearing the right clothes, using the right language. In the case of internet subcultures, it's very much about knowing the right kind of slang, and, knowing all the obscure references and stuff like that. And that is kind of how they cohere themselves in some way, by hatred of people who are outside of the subculture. So, I mean, I'm not going to go through the whole book in a way, because if you're here, you've probably either read it or heard some kind of a synopsis of it. But instead, I will say a few words about what has happened since. Because in the closing of the book, I was saying, this has the potential to go into the real world and not just be an online phenomenon. Because at that time, the riots in Berkeley had just happened over a Milo Yiannopoulos talk. And that has certainly happened since. There's obviously been, an attempt to bring it all into real life. The most far-right elements of it have, in a way, capitalized the most, and have become the most prominent since, because they have a coherent political worldview. The others, who are just sort of trolling or who are sort of alt-light, who don't really know what they believe in many cases, you know, just couldn't keep up basically with the far right kind of core of it, if you like, who had thought through their ideas and so on. So obviously you had Charlottesville, where you know, a protester was killed, and it all became a lot more serious because people who thought that it was maybe funny or it was partly a joke or there was any element of irony or playfulness in it were suddenly faced with the reality of what it really is politically, or at least what that serious political core of it is about. And for years, if you talked about the alt-right or any kind of online, let's say, reactionary movements, you were always told that you didn't get the joke, that it was ironic. And pretty much right up until Charlottesville, people continued to say that. And now nobody can really say that with a straight face because, you know, it got very serious, and people who were researching it kind of showed, you know, what the political kind of component of it, the serious political component of it, have been saying for years. So, for example, openly saying, you know, you may not like the alt-right brand, but we can't say white nationalists, so just say that. And, you know, that's what they say amongst themselves. In terms of what has happened in reaction to the book, I was just saying to Cheryl, I feel I need to reread the book because I've been having arguments about a book that I didn't write for months, arguments that I didn't actually make. And I even see sometimes people who like the book and people who hate the book sort of battling each other online. And the people who like the book are even arguing the case for things I didn't actually say because they're trying to defend me against the other people. But the strange outcome of it, which I genuinely didn't expect, and I even dread to say this because if I say it, it will be seized upon as evidence of my secret reactionary politics or something like that. But it is true that I haven't got the bad reaction from the alt-right that I was expecting. You know, I did lots of, you know, online security stuff, and I had many sleepless nights worrying about what would happen if my email was hacked, or, you know, I imagined all the sort of horrible videos that they would make and so on. And that actually hasn't really happened, strangely. I'm always waiting for it. It doesn't quite happen. So I remember somebody said when the book first came out on Twitter that like Nagle and the alt-right are like Clarice Starling and Hannibal Lecter. They won't attack her. They'd consider it rude, which has actually turned out to be true. But the main kind of group of people that I've received most attacks from have been kind of on the left, pretty much, and they've been a mixture of. Well, I mean, I won't be kind because they haven't been nice to me. So they've been a mixture of like very cretinous, kind of like anarchist, liberal, sort of radical people, and some of them have been kind of like trots with sort of terrible blogs who have been like left behind by the Corbyn and Bernie thing, and they're sort of left behind, but they've still got their blogs, so they have to they have to make sure that they have to attack anything that has any popular appeal whatsoever. So they have their boycott any popular left-wing magazine campaigns, and their you know, boycott any popular left-wing writer campaigns and so on. And yeah, so I that was disappointing in a way, but also not, because there was a there was a kind of wave of nice reviews, you know, from all over the place, but you know, from kind of writers on the left who I respect and who are good, and then there was the backlash. Then I think there's a bit of a backlash against the backlash, so that people who like the book really like it and have even been kind of defending it online. So thank you if you're one of those people. So I guess I will just say a few things about why the alt-right have appeal. And here I'm not really talking about all the various kind of little micro subcultures I was looking at online. I'm really talking about the actual alt-right, if you like, the far right that was there kind of within the the alt-right or the new far-right or whatever you want to call it. I think that part of their appeal, and why I think that those who find themselves now opposing them but trying to use some of their ideas, what are sometimes called the alt-light, I think that they are not going to succeed in actually opposing them, because their ideas are just too weak right now. I think that the alt-right appeal to people because there is certainly in the online world, for younger people who kind of came of age online and were politicized online, you know, certain kind of the de-anonymized internet, if you like, the social media where your name is attached and where you have to, you know, put your name to everything you say, and particularly the kind of, I guess, liberal kind of social media world became a kind of place where you could, you know, one badly phrased, insensitively phrased tweet and your life could be over, basically, or your social life, certainly your career maybe even. And, you know, it became very prone to groupthink and censorship and very humorless and very scolding and not very much fun. And the alt-right was a kind of a haven for people who wanted to go in and be anonymous and say whatever kind of taboo stuff they wanted to say. You know, we know that, you know, while there is a kind of a polite layer of you might call it political correctness or whatever, a certain etiquette that we have, that, you know, beneath that there are kind of reactionary views that are kind of under the surface and that are not being talked about. Whether they should be talked about, you know, or whether is another question, because I'm actually in favor of certain kinds of parameters of, like, you know, politeness, I guess, and stuff like that. I don't think that you know, I don't want to listen to Milo Yiannopoulos all the time, or I don't want to have to discuss whether the Holocaust happened or not all the time, you know. So, you know, we all have some kind of, and actually, you know, interestingly, some people have commented on this before, but I think it bears repeating. When Milo Yiannopoulos, the videos came out of him defending relationships between adults and kind of early teen or preteen boys, you know, those on the right who were always claiming to defend freedom of speech got rid of him instantly, and they made no apologies about getting rid of him because they found his idea offensive, and it was, after all, just an idea. So, you know, I think that when people on the left say the right are not really in favor of freedom of speech, they're just being opportunistic. That's true. You know, I think that given half the chance, they would certainly not allow any kind of dissent, or they would get rid of their opponents. I think part of their appeal is also a kind of collectivism. That is something they talk about a lot, and it's sort of implicit in a lot of their language, and that they reject kind of essentially liberal individualism, and they are radical in the sense that they are going to the very root of that, and they're rejecting it, you know, at that very basic level. I think that you know, every idea has a kind of cycle where it at some point has energy, lots of intellectual energy behind it, and then at a certain point it becomes kind of flabby because it hasn't had to defend itself in a really long time. And I think kind of liberal individualism is at that point now, where just last night I was watching the debate between Jacobin and Reason magazine, and it was amazing how much stronger the Jacobin side were, in my opinion, anyway. And the arguments that the people from Reason were making, which were very much in favor of a total kind of individualism, felt incredibly weak to me. They sounded incredibly weak, and that wouldn't have been the case even, say, 5 to 10 years ago. I think that it used to be that people, you know, even though I've always disagreed with them, people making free market arguments were sharp, and they had their arguments kind of very sharpened, and they were always ready for debate. But now, increasingly, I think that feels like it's dying, like it doesn't have kind of much energy to it. And I think younger people are also starting to feel like many, the world that they sort of have only ever known, which is the one that is created by that kind of liberal individualist culture, is falling apart in a way because the very idea of progress is being questioned, I think, by younger people, by millennials and so on. In modernity, you kind of lose everything, and the only thing you gain is material progress, which is no small thing. It means you don't die in childbirth and all kinds of good stuff like that, but you do lose everything in the process. You lose traditional cultures, you lose indigenous cultures, you lose languages, you lose everything. And when progress stops kind of delivering on the material grounds, which it doesn't anymore for younger people, most of us cannot have the basic things that our parents had, like a house, or any kind of stable job or anything like that. And so when those things stop delivering, I think people start to look around and say, what is all of this for? What maybe we could look at the world differently. So I think that progress, individualism, all those things are being questioned in really fundamental ways. The part of the alt-right's appeal is obviously just totally sinister, in my opinion. It really is about the strong convincing themselves that they are actually the victims, so they can morally justify attacking people who are actually in a vulnerable position, and all of that. So I'm not saying this as we have to feel bad for them or anything like that, but I do think that the broader kind of backdrop of what people who are sort of a bit older find totally baffling, like why are younger people all attaching themselves to these crazy kind of radical ideologies all of a sudden on the left as well. I think it is because those kind of end of history, kind of settled, what we thought were settled ideas are all kind of falling apart now.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much, Angela. I wonder if there'll be any of these cretinous anarchists in here tonight. Not sure. Surely not. Brilliant. So over to you, Cheryl.
Hi. The culture wars online and off are vicious and really kind of, you have to fit into this binary of either a kind of fawning adulation, or maybe just posting kittens, or a nasty kind of spiteful trolling and name calling. And I try to keep out of all that as much as I can. I don't go on Twitter very much at all. My comments really are going to be more about the kind of the ideas in the book, the history in the book, the politics in the book. So the kind of online culture wars do leave me cold, but I have seen online some of the reaction to Angela's book, and they do tend to fit into those two categories, either a kind of fawning adulation or a kind of nice, nasty, spiteful trolling, right? And I really hope that today in this forum we can all be a little bit more subtle about it and discuss the book and the ideas in the book, with a bit more kind of complexity and sensitivity. I read the book in the summer. I really liked the book. It did open up a world to me that I wasn't very familiar with. I was first introduced to it by Angela in her Baffler article on 4chan, which I immediately kind of recognized in that article that here was someone who could think seriously about the problems that we're facing, that she was somebody who was very thorough in her work, and that somebody that we should be taking seriously. One of the reviews of the book, a review by James Livingston, called her an old lefty's idea of what a young lefty should be. And, and while I resist the label old, as someone who has been around the left in both the UK and the US for around 30 years, I was delighted to see some kind of a re-emergence of some kind of critical, truly radical thinking in the next generation. So I have a couple of questions. I've been asked to pose some questions to Angela. I'm going to do that in a kind of friendly vein, but mildly critical. And I wanted to just take a minute to say what I really like about the book, what I think the book does really well, and why it's such a great contribution to the discussion today. And actually, the things I'm going to mention are things which haven't really been part of the discussion around the book in the aftermath, and things that maybe they should be more kind of at the centre of our thinking about these issues. So beyond the general kind of great mass of eye-opening information about the rise of the alt-right and the many insights into internet culture and how dystopian it's become. And when I only joined Twitter last year, and I think I clicked twice and came across some anti-Semitic kind of rant, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's so right about Twitter. So anyway, I tried to avoid it. But what I really like about the book is its recognition of the ubiquitous nature of rebellion, or a rebellious stance. So the kind of rejection of conformity, of wanting to adopt an outsider's mantle, but without there being any real content to that rebellion, no direction given for the protest, and so that it becomes a kind of empty posturing, and that therefore both left and right can equally fill that kind of empty shell and claim to be the rebels. The push or the motivation behind the rebellion is a distaste for the mainstream, you know, hence the title of the book, the mainstream, the normies. And I think that the book really understands that, so that while the left and right subcultures have different solutions to the problem, they are oppositional to one another and at each end, but what they share is a deeply anti-democratic distrust or dislike, or even active hatred for the majority of their fellow citizens. So that's the first thing that I like that the book really highlights, and I don't think has really been discussed much in the aftermath. And the second thing I like about it is that Angela is brave enough to engage in some self-examination as a leftist. She follows in the tradition of George Orwell here in the UK and Christopher Lash in the US, of making herself very unpopular among her own people. And she does that by forcing them to take a long, hard look in the mirror and to deal with the limitations of the left. As she says, you know, most of the attacks or the criticisms of the book have come from leftists. I was defending the book on Corey Robbins' Facebook thread feed about it, and I was asked whether I believed that trans women were women, and I just thought, what on earth has that got to do with anything I've said? And it was, you know, it was this kind of Stalinist re-educator who was kind of so intolerant that if anybody likes that book, it must mean that they are transphobic. It's just completely crazy to me. And the chapter on the Tumblr liberalism in the book was the best part for me, and I wanted more of it. You know, I really thought there could have been another chapter on that. So, but the left obviously don't like it, and it has been the kind of backlash to that chapter that's dominated the discussion since. Okay, so that's what I like about it. So I'm going to ask you a question now. My first question is speaking to the history and the nature of the outsider status that's kind of set up here. So I've mentioned to you before Grace Hale's book on called The Nation of Outsiders, which is about that kind of cultural outsider being part of the American way of being, and that really it kind of exists, a rejection of the mainstream exists in American culture, and it has done for a long time over the course of its history. There's a desire to be seen as more real, more authentic, all the way from 19th century kind of minstrelry through James Dean, through Bob Dylan, you know, these kind of cultural icons. And she includes conservatives among that. And she actually points out that William Buckley, who you know, was really the first person to kind of cultivate this oppositional style against campus liberal orthodoxy. So he developed an idea of the liberal elite and develops a model of the conservative rebel kind of rebelling against that domination of the liberals. You can see as well in George W. Bush, he kind of develops this folksy image, you know, the Texas rancher and everything. Even if they're not outsiders, they want to present themselves as outsiders from the mainstream. So my question then is, what is new about that today? Is it just that it's the platform? Is it the internet that kind of makes the reach broader? Or is this just a problem of modernity? And Marshall Berman discusses this and understands it as a problem of modernity, kind of this loss of authenticity and always a kind of reaching back for it. Or is there something more specific about the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's significant that, you know, that it is coming from America. I mean, now you see a lot more, like on alt-right forums and stuff like that, there's a lot more European voices in there. But a lot of the time they're more just like recognizably far right. You know, this as a kind of subculture or a set of subcultures, you know, is a very American thing. And I think that possibly has to do not just with modernity, but with maybe a lack of a, coming from a very young country, and in many cases, you know, being maybe just a few generations in from, you know, immigrants and so on, that because there isn't a normative kind of national culture maybe or something like that, you have to define yourself in terms of some uniqueness that you have. Like a very interesting example is, I'm fascinated now, maybe it'll be the next thing I write about, the Catholic internet, or like Catholic Twitter. And it's very interesting because, you know, I met some of the people who are involved in First Things magazine, for example, which is a very highbrow, sort of very intellectual Catholic magazine. But the funny thing about them is, and I hope if they ever see this, they'll not be offended by me saying this, but they all have these waspy names, and they're all converts. And they wear quite sort of young fogey clothes, and they're really hyper intellectual. And you know, I met one of them, and she was very interesting, very smart, and I was saying, oh, so are you a convert as well? I'm not a convert, but she was there with other converts. And she said yes, and I asked her about how she converted, and it was like a, you know, like a 20-step process, which was this incredibly rational, cerebral kind of process, which started with reading Joyce, and then we ended up at the Jesuits and all this kind of stuff. But anyway, the point I'm getting to is,
and both William Buckley and Milo are
yes,
Catholic, right?
yeah. But you know, so I was thinking, God, the sort of Egypts back home, Catholics back home would not even be able to have a conversation with these people, because the Catholic Church in Ireland is so uncultivated, and like, but that's because it comes to people naturally, because that's their normative culture. That's what they're born into. It's not part of their identity. Whereas if it's part of your identity, you're placing yourself as an individual outside of the mainstream in some way. Even by being a Catholic, you know, in the American context. So I mean, it is particular to America to some extent, in that those people would not make any sense if you place them in Ireland, right? Because they'd just be Catholics like most other people. So it is an American thing, but it's definitely spreading. Like, you know, I think it's more and more common. I mean, I wouldn't say, for example, even certainly my grandparents, even to a large extent my parents, generation wouldn't have any sense of that you need to be outside of the mainstream, that there's anything good about, you know, they were happy to be, they just didn't conceive of themselves in that way. It just didn't make any sense. Now I think that kind of culture from the US has spread, certainly to the English-speaking world, to such an extent that I think younger people can't even really conceive of themselves, like at a very deep level, who, you know, sort of thinking about who they are. I don't think that they can even really conceive of themselves as having meaning as an individual without anchoring that to some kind of niche or particular kind of cultural like signifiers. Like you know, if you go on social media, the first thing you're asked to do is define yourself, you know, in your bio. You're building your personal brand all the time, and this is why I think I'm rambling a little bit, but this is why I think people get so traumatized when they get attacked online. You know, like some people say, why, well, just get over it. Like someone said something mean to you. I think one of the reasons, like John Ronson studied this really well, that people are so affected by it is because the boundary between, you know, some independent or core person, you know, at the core of who you are, and that brand that you have worked on every day for several hours a day, you know, for years on end, is very blurred. And if somebody comes in and essentially destroys the brand, or you know, you have this thing reflected back to you that's telling you you're a terrible person, I think very few people are able to just have a complete separation and say, no, I have some core person that is me, that is not, you know, this niche little perfect individual brand. So I think it's getting worse in that sense, or it's getting more pronounced in that sense, in that there kind of isn't a mainstream anymore. It's not like there's a mainstream and then you have these rebels on the outside. It's all rebels on the outside. I mean, mainstream, the infrastructure of mainstream culture is collapsing. The news, you know, the mainstream media is collapsing. It probably won't even last beyond a couple of years. And so who now who now hasn't participated in the niche, you know, brand making of the self that goes on online? Everyone is doing it now. There is no mainstream, basically.
No, I really would agree with that, and I think that the mainstream is crumbling, and it's under fire, and it doesn't have any confidence in itself, you know, at the kind of centre. But I think the alt-right and the SJWs, or the Tumblr left, or you know, the people, the small groups really on each side who are attacking them, they are talked about as the problem, right? And they are conceived in your book as the problem. But isn't the real problem that centre that is incapable of holding? Isn't the real problem the kind of mainstream liberal centre, you know, where it has no kind of resonance, where it has no strength, and it has no self-belief, you know? Isn't that in itself a real problem? And do we not need an alternative to it that is not going to depend on its weakness, if you like? So that can become the solution itself, rather than kind of continually feeding on the weakness of the centre. So, you know, the recognition that the reason for Trump, and I think we maybe disagree on this, but the reason for Trump, you know, I don't think was Milo. I think the reason for Trump was Hillary, right? And so the biggest problem is not the alt-right. It's really where the culture wars were won by the left, and the economic battles were won by the right, and you have this kind of extreme individualism, which they both agree on, whether it's identity politics or, you know, capitalism, but they're unable to defend capitalism or liberal individualism, as you mentioned earlier. I mean, you see the Tory party, they found themselves in the position of having to defend capitalism, and they completely were unable to do it. Right? It's like, this is the Tory party. It's just crazy. So in the end, isn't the demand for conformity the bigger problem? And that demand comes from the left much more so than it does from the right.
All right. Well, I would just say, I mean, one of the arguments I try to make to others on the left about this is I don't accept. I mean, most of the people and the particular kind of like subsection or like little culture within the left that I'm critiquing, I don't see that as me attacking the left. I see that as me critiquing a group of people who relentlessly attack the only viable bits of the left, you know? And so I don't see that as me attacking the left. Like, you know, I don't want to say, you know, left and right are meaningless or whatever. Like, obviously, very broadly speaking, it is meaningful. You know, they are meaningful categories. But, you know, I think it's a section of the left, and I think it's very cancerous, and I wish it would go away. And I think the rest of the left would flourish, actually, if it would just, if that little tendency or whatever you want to call it, crankish kind of tendency.
Well, it is like the kind of, it is the censorious, the finger wagging, you know, that kind of, which, you know, is today, it's all over this Me Too campaign and the kind of sexual harassment being kind of elevated into this, you know, mass crisis for the mainstream. You know, this has come from the left. These kinds of campaigns have come from the left. You know, isn't that a problem, that the demand for conformity comes from the left, that there isn't, and then that gives more scope for the right to say we are the rebels, you know, and makes them more attractive.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I have, since I've written the book, I've had kind of progressive, like middle-aged academics coming up to me and saying, I'm really worried my son is alt-right. So it has, yeah, like obviously if you're a 13-year-old boy and your parents are like sociology professors or something, it's like there's nowhere else to go. So the right does get to be the fun crowd sometimes with that kind of stuff. But I don't know. I mean, see, if it was like, on the one hand, a lot of this stuff, it always goes too far to the point where where everyone must repeat whatever it is, the hashtag of the day or whatever. But at the same time, you know, even say, for example, women on panels, right, is a constant, diversity in general on panels is a constant kind of online war that goes on. And on the one hand, when I see kind of anyone who organizes an event getting sort of attacked for not having diverse enough panels, and they want this, like, what feels like a very tokenistic head count kind of thing all the time, that is very annoying. But then sometimes I do also think, I'm still glad that it's there. I'm annoyed that it's so relentless and it's so horrible in the way that it goes about what it's doing, but I'm still glad it's there. I mean, it's you know, just to use a kind of example that came to mind. There's this wonderful documentary that I'm always recommending people watch called Rocky Road to Dublin, right? And it's made in 1968, and it's kind of about Ireland being liberalized basically by the 60s. But there's a really interesting scene in it where it's like Trinity students who are all smoking and drinking somewhere in Trinity College, and they're all guys. There's one woman there, and they're all incredibly confident and very articulate and very aggressive, and they're all like, you know, shouting over each other and stuff like that. And this woman who's there kind of tries to get in a couple of times, and she gets in, she manages to say one thing, and they're just like, no, that's stupid. And they just ignore it. And everyone who sees it now kind of is really shocked. You know, but I'm glad that we're shocked by that now. Do you know what I mean? And that didn't happen out of nowhere. Like the liberal kind of cultural left, if you like, did achieve something in at least making us think twice about that kind of stuff. So I don't know how you have one without the other. Maybe the only way you impose new taboos is by being horrible. I don't know.
I really hope not.
Okay, well, thank you all for that. That was absolutely fantastic. We're going to have a Q&A now. So we have 2 radio mics. Here we go. So Ben's going to go around the audience with one, and then the other one will go to the panel. So there's lots of you with, I'm sure, lots of questions. So if I can ask you to be concise and direct with your remarks, and same to the panel. We'll take one from each kind of section. So over here first. Yes.
Hi. Hi, I want to ask a question. I'm going to be formulating as I go along, and I'm not going to turn it into a, hey, this is an observation rather than a question thing, because that's just awful, isn't it? Yeah. And we're in an irony death spiral. Okay, so you mentioned Jonathan Pye, Millennial Woes, art school context. Now I'm thinking about the visual culture of this stuff, and I'm thinking particularly about this kind of crossover between post-internet art and maybe the visual culture of the alt-right. And I'm thinking about the debates that came out around the show, the ill-advised, to say the least, show at LD50 in Dalston. You may have picked up on this. I'm pretty sure it would have been on your radar. I'd be really interested to know what you think about this, maybe a radicalization process rather than a culture war. It's using fairly innocuous material to then, you know, blur the boundaries and get yourselves into a position where you can launch actual Nazi stuff into an audience. Now, I'm kind of concerned that basically the entirety of this kind of post-internet art thing is sort of acting in a sort of way as in that way that Annie's just described. I wondered if you had any thoughts about this. I mean, the politics of a lot of that art that's kind of grouped under the post-internet label are pretty ambiguous or non-existent at best, maybe kind of identitarian, if you can identify anything at all. There's this kind of
I think if we bring it to the heart.
Anyway, that's it. That's all. The question is,
perfect.
I guess I'm asking is, can art itself and galleries, can they be part of this duping and this radicalization?
Fantastic. Thank you. So, gentleman at the front here now, I think.
Yep.
And then we'll take one more on this side.
Yeah, my question is a bit more complex than that. A joke.
Christ.
No. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about the alt-right and so on, and identity politics and identitarianism in the left and so on. But my question is, how much legitimacy do you think the idea of an alt-left has? You know, a slightly thicker-skinned, sort of mock Stalinist, arguably, left-wing that organises on the basis of whatever the opposition says, we don't care. We've got better politics, and we will just out-organise you. You see it in Momentum, you see it in groups like that. Do you think that has any hope of actually sustaining a left-wing victory?
Okay, great question. So, yeah, the lady in the middle there.
Yep.
Just wait for the microphone.
Hi, quick question. So, how much do you think this rise in the alt-right is linked to the doctrines of austerity in both the UK and the US?
My kind of question. Okay, yeah, so if we go back to the panel now and address them, does anyone want to go first?
Let's get the microphone.
Of course.
Okay, so the first one, it is interesting to see how, particularly that guy Sam Hyde, the first person I mentioned, you know, is extremely talented, and you know, he had a show on Adult Swim and it got cancelled after they kind of, you know, figured out the politics of it or something like that, or his own politics on Twitter. But I mean, lots of different critics, I'm thinking of somebody like Robert Hughes, like when he described kind of the way he saw contemporary art going, he described it very much as being ugly, being nihilistic, you know, being transgressive to the point of nihilism, that kind of thing. And it's very easy to see why that aesthetic would appeal on the alt-right, or why they would be able to use that, or maybe, you know, I mean, in a way, like Nazi comparisons are always slightly embarrassing to make because of because they're too plentiful online and stuff like that. But you know, the Weimar kind of parallel is there, like, you know, the sense that, you know, art school, these kind of art school veterans who became reactionaries. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it's like you know, it does have a parallel with the reactionary kind of rejection of Jewish art and stuff like that in the Weimar Republic. But in terms of, is it actually helping it along? I mean, I guess it's helping it in the sense, maybe the fetish for the fetishization of transgression as an aesthetic ideal over any number of other things that have, you know, animated artists over the centuries. That maybe, you know, if you think that transgression is a good in and of itself, then why not, you know, transgress the liberal taboos as well? As for the alt-left thing, I mean, that term alt-left has gone through a couple of different cycles, because originally when I heard it being used, it was very much like the way you've used it. But then Donald Trump used it, and people started using it to just mean the left, kind of, or and it all got a bit confused. I do remember somebody on Twitter saying there's only one, when people were trying to say, like, what is the alt-left, what does it mean? People were saying the only person who's actually alt-left is Michael Tracy, you know, because he gets retweeted by the alt-right all the time, and he's really, well, he's maybe more pro-Russian than most people on the left or whatever. But yeah, definitely. I mean, I actually think that kind of culture that is there very noticeably in Momentum, and that is there on the left now, is really great. And I really just like, it feels like the last hope. Like, please, I hope it really just flourishes and doesn't get killed by just really humorless, divisive crap that tends to, you know, ruin movements and stuff like that. Oh, my writing is unreadable, so I can't remember the last question. Sorry. If anyone else can remember.
Austerity. So I'm a lot more cynical, I think, about the alt-left, or any kind of idea of the alt-left, because I haven't seen much evidence of it yet, and my fear is that, you know, of a kind of alternative left that isn't either, like, the modes of communication. This is something that I really want to address, is that on the one hand you have the kind of pomo left, which has this kind of detached irony, which, you know, which kind of reflects their inability or unwillingness to take anything seriously or get anything done or have any real impact in the world, but shows how cool they are, right? And on the other hand, a really kind of over-sincere, kind of finger-wagging, censorious, puritanical search for recognition and wanting to impose, you know, your worldview onto everyone else. And really, the problem with the first mode of communication is that inability to take anything seriously. And the problem with the second mode is that it doesn't recognize any changes that have actually happened, right? So the whole world and history is full of all the examples of how racist and sexist and intolerant everything that we all are, and both of them actually reflect a real anti-democratic kind of idea, you know, that they don't trust people. Just on the austerity, I think with Trump, you know, it was a response to, I think, the economic woes and everything, but it wasn't just that. So, you know, his mode of communication obviously doesn't have that much wide appeal. You know, everyone's embarrassed by his tweets and everything. But what he did was he recognized a kind of anti-globalization feeling, sentiment amongst people who had lost their jobs because of that, and because of people who had a kind of cultural resistance to liberal condescension. And he kind of combined those two in his appeal to the American electorate, I think.
That's it. Great. So lots of questions, not a particularly large amount of time. So I think if we take two from this side of the room, Ben, then come back, help them address them quickly, and then try the other side. So,
there you go.
yeah, sure.
Hiya. Earlier you talked about the kind of disregard that kind of the far right has for the normies. It's in the title of your book. But I remember one of the prominent posts I saw post Charlottesville was this kind of long piece that was about how we get them on our side. And I think moving on, the certain figures in the alt-right, specifically people like, say, Richard Spencer, who have not only a very specific worldview, but a worldview that they want to see imposed, are going to start trying to reach out to the normies, and I think we're going to see less of that. But I do agree, you know, as someone in the metal community, you quite often see people screaming about Metallica tops and Topshop and all that kind of stuff. So,
Fantastic. And one more from this side of the room. Yeah, at the back there.
So it might be a too simple a question, but I find the way that you use the term right, alt-right, new right, just incredibly confusing and unhelpful. And exactly the same with the left. When you talk about the left and the left's response, there's no content to any of that. It's a kind of label where left is good, right is bad, but without any real meaning. The thing that I really liked about your book, Angela, was the chapter on transgression, because I think you really started to look at what it is that's alienating people and what it is that's that people are trying to do with their lives and with their interaction in society to challenge something that is incredibly boring. Politics now is so dull, it's unbelievable. There is no distinction between left and right. There is no distinction between the Tories and Labour. For me, well, you might think so. You might think so, but I don't see it.
Okay, well, I think sufficient controversy might have been caused by this point.
So
there?
Could you elaborate a little bit more in terms of content of what you're talking about?
Brilliant. So I think actually I'm going to ignore what I said earlier and go here, and then we'll go back to the panel. So, yes, lady at the front. Just wait for the microphone.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about particularly like online activism and the difference between like left and right, particularly with safe spaces and the idea of sort of their value in online activism. Because I guess 4chan and that sort of thing act as a sort of safe space for the right, even though they would absolutely not like that being said. And then also you get obviously the safe spaces for the left, how much they sort of serve to be a place where you can discuss ideas without, you know, someone coming in and saying, oh, the Holocaust didn't happen, and how much they serve to sort of radicalise and just have this like echo chamber that is just actually really counterproductive. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so at the back there, and then I think, sorry, we'll have to come back to the panel.
I've never been to anything like this. Firstly, thanks. It's been awesome to watch 3 learned people debate something. Is there not an argument with 4chan to say that the world's full of cunts and it's easier to keep those people in one place so you don't have to deal with them on a daily basis? Because I don't know, I mean, I'm a wrestling fan, and wrestling's full of cunts. Right, you go down the message board, and every third post is it's SJWs everywhere, they're all around, right? And you keep them there. I don't need to talk to that person anymore because they're obviously a bell end, right? So isn't there an argument for keeping people away from discourse? Well, because they're evidently bell ends, they don't need to be involved.
Interesting. Okay, so not an awful lot of time, so we'll come back to the panel now. If you could take 1-2 minutes, just perhaps address what you thought was fantastic.
Okay, on the first question of the left and right and all of what you were saying, I mean, I think you might be in a minority in thinking that politics is boring right now, because everyone else is completely baffled by politics right now, because it's like it's very, well, I mean, at least in my lifetime, it's pretty dramatic. I mean, you know, it does feel a bit like in Britain there is a bit of a return of a more recognizable right and left. And And, you know, then in the US, you have the constant drama of the Trump thing. It's sort of like, no, you can't take your eyes off it with, you know, characters like Sebastian Gorka and Scaramucci and stuff. They're unbelievable. I think they're just incredibly funny. And like, I never remember politics being, I never remember being so glued to kind of like formal or electoral politics. It's true, the right-left categories are a bit of a mess, and, you know, like when people use them, they may be thinking more in terms of a kind of French Revolution like divide, or a Cold War one, or, you know, there are lots of other kind of axes like, you know, modern versus romantic, and, you know, lots of other ways you can kind of, you know, so for example, the alt-right is very influenced by the French New Right, and this kind of, and they would often say when they're, you know, speaking amongst themselves on each other's podcasts and things like that, you know, for example, I've heard Richard Spencer say that he would rather try to draw people from the left, that mainstream conservatives are just gone, and it will not be possible to convert them or whatever, and that actually people on the left are more interesting. Spencer was a big fan of the Frankfurt School when he was in college and stuff like that. So, and, you know, and there is actually, you know, I've seen people be converted, you know, to the alt-right from the left. Who well, National Socialist, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, what he will say is, yeah. No, it's true. What he will say is, you know, we have basically that, you know, for example, he would say he wants to like triple or something the amount of national parks that there are and things like that, and that, you know, yeah, there is a coherent people, and he thinks in those terms, so he's a collectivist and so on. Yeah. So it's true that the right-left thing is a mess, but, you know, sometimes just to complete a sentence, you have to throw in a bit of a crappy term because it would be too long otherwise, you know. So even the term alt-right means a million different things depending on who you're talking to. I'm using a very strict definition just because it's simpler. But lots of people who say alt-right might mean, you know, like, for example, I heard my dad using it the other day, and he was talking about Steve Bannon. So I've heard other people use it and they're talking about Gamergate or something like that. So those are all quite different politically, and it's just become a bit of a vague term for some kind of irreverent, like Trumpian right that doesn't quite look like what went before. They're not the neocons, and they're not really traditional conservatives. They're offensive and they're kind of irreverent and stuff like that. So some people mean it in that very vague way. Others are being very precise about it. I can only apologize about the lack of, you know, the fact that I'm using it I'm using left and right in a little bit vague terms, but I mean, they are vague in a way. In terms of the safe spaces thing, I mean, they're kind of, you know, they're easy to mock, and, you know, they have all kinds of roots in, you know, gay rights activism, and but also in kind of corporate ideology, where it's very much about, you know, like psychologists who are employed by corporations to come up with ways of managing people at work, that they would enter into like a circle of people, other employees, and they would have to say, you made me feel bad when you said this or whatever. And it is, you know, it feels very therapeutic and so on. I don't really relish making fun of it that much, because you know, I mean, if people want to have those things in an organization or whatever, among people, among others who want to communicate with each other in that way, that's fine.
I think probably we'll have to move along.
Oh, yeah,
Oh,
sure.
no.
So the question about keeping all those alt-right people kind of contained, or online, where we can study them like specimens or something, I don't know. I think that I think it misunderstands the problem, because I probably differ with Angela on this, but I don't think that it starts online and comes offline. I think the problem starts in the real world and then is reflected in the online cultures. I think that there is an awful lot of atomization, and there's a lot of kind of individuals feeling that they don't belong anywhere, they don't have any sense of kind of purpose or meaning in their lives. They're very atomized, they're very disconnected from any kind of sense of value system or anything. The Catholic thing is really interesting if that's where you're going to go, but because that is a kind of, obviously, if people were converting to Catholicism as a new identity, it's obvious that's a reflection of that really deep need for some kind of meaning. So, the San Bernardino murders, with the guy went and shot all these women because he couldn't get laid, like that. That was about his own, individual atomization, and they're everywhere, in Vegas. So those acts, and they're becoming more common, those acts of violent rage that people don't know what to do with their anguish and their angst, and so they think everybody else is the problem. What we need to do is to develop a progressive political solution that shows people that everyone else is the solution, actually, they're not the problem, and that we need some kind of collective sense amongst ourselves, a democratic collective sense amongst ourselves, that we can do something about it and that we belong together, and we can change the world together. But I don't think Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party is that vehicle. I think Jeremy Corbyn's a nice guy. He's got some good ideas and everything. I don't think he's got much backbone. He's anti-EU and is unable to stand up for Brexit against all of the Blairites in his party, kind
I
of
think perhaps this
yelling
might be an
at him.
entirely other discussion we'd be beginning there.
Sorry,
a wonderful one,
but if we're talking about the Labour Party as an alternative to the point raised over here, the Labour Party as an alternative to the Tories, I don't see that.
Great, well, thank you very much, and thanks for your questions. We're going to take a short break now. Sorry if I didn't get all of your questions. There's a whole day of debate and discussion ahead.